Yo, this is Urban Dub. This is my tutorial on my track Loudmouth. I'm going to talk you through the process of how I made it, why I made it, from drums, bass, synth, sound effects, mix downs, mastering. I'm going to cover as much as I can. So what you're looking at is Cubase. It doesn't matter what DAW you use. It could be Ableton, Fruity Loops, Logic. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go over various techniques that can be used in any type of DAW. So yeah, let's get stuck in. So let's check out the track. So first of all, I want to talk about the concept. Before I even started the record, I decided I wanted to make a track that was based around some old school drum breaks, a kind of throwback to early sort of 2000 drum and bass, with a new school flavour. So I spent a day in my studio going through drum breaks, chopping them up, cleaning them up, running them through some hardware in my studio. I've got an SSL bus compressor and a high def 55 EQ, and then I proceeded to chop them up, reprogram them to create grooves that inspired me. And yeah, then that was the start of the track. The track was born, the creative process was started. So like any track, you need a good foundation to start with. So I based this track around some drum breaks. So let's look at this first break. When you zoom into the waveform, you can see it's nice and loud. It's already been pre-processed. Let's check out the effects. Here I've just used Soothe, taming some of the tops. And you can see the various settings there. It's nothing drastic. It's just literally calming down a tiny bit at the top end. So let's move on to the second break. This is more of an aim and break. You can hear it's heavily compressed. I did that with the bus compressor, the outboard SSL. Let's see what additional effects I've used. So Pro Q3 and the stock Cubase EQ. So there I've just ducked in some of the tops. Pro Q3 I've actually set in mid-side mode, and I'm controlling some of the stereo information with this dynamic EQ. There's also a small cut on the tops there. So when you play them together, you'll see it's a question and answer. This was the foundation for pretty much the entire tune. There's some additional breaks. Again, I'd pre-processed it, chopped it up. It's full of energy and it really works in that section of the track. So let's move on. This green block here, I use for a turnaround, so it's like an impact moment. Really raggo, top-endy kind of break. Let's see what effects I've added. So some Crave EQ, just cutting a rogue frequency out. As you can see there, it's poking out, just taming it a little bit. And then I've added Isotope Trash. I use trash quite a lot through this song. You're going to see it on many different instruments. So it's set in multi-band mode. The low frequencies, nothing's going on. Mid frequencies, I've used clip control. High frequencies, again, clip control. You can see I've adjusted the mix here, and the overall dry wet mix here. I'm using it to add some saturation, kind of filling out the drum break. So that's a quick look at the breaks. Let's look at the additional drums, the main kick and snare. The breaks on their own were a bit thin, so I needed some additional drums to fatten them up. So first of all, let's look at this blue block here. It says Serum Snare. So I'll make the loop there, zoom in a bit. We're going to quickly scan over this. There's plenty of tutorials out there where you can learn how to make snare drums in Serum, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but let's take a quick look. So the main oscillator here, oscillator A, I was using the basic shapes wavetable. I used the noise generator as the towel, and there's some additional effects as well. Let's have a listen to the snare. On the snare I've got some additional processing. Let's take all that off and have another listen. So let's have a look at the processing. Again, I've used trash in multi-band mode. I've used the wave shaper on the lows, and I've used electric trash on the tops. Next I've used shaper box. This actually shapes the sound, so it's a volume curve. So I'm shortening the snare to remove some of the white noise tail and just sort of control the length of the snare drum. After that I've used transient shaper. I've added some attack, some pump, and reduced the sustain. From there I've used shaper box again. This time shortening the snare massively. I've added some noise as well, using the smooth chorus setting. Then after that I've used flatline, which is a clipper, shaving off some of the transients I added with Kilohertz transient shaper. Again I've used shaper box, this time with some more noise. Put some of the length back. Classic Camel Crusher. Unfortunately it's not really supported in Cubase anymore, but you can still access it in this generic mode. So I've used some tube and some compression as well. And the final part of the processing is Soothe 2, removing some of the top end. So when designing this snare, I'm obviously using my ears. All these different processes were added one by one until I was happy with the snare. The next snare layer I want to look at is this addictive drum snare. So I've taken a snare drum, pitched it, and adjusted the envelope slightly to let some of the initial transient through from the serum snare and another transient I created. Nothing crazy going on, it's just a snare drum. It sounds pretty crap on its own. Let's have a look at what processing's on it. Again, I've used flatline. Taming some of the transient. Again, trash. Just use this wave shaper here. You can see the mix and the full dry wet. I use convolution reverb. This one's by Melder, so we can bypass it. Put it back in. It's very subtle, but it adds some more stereo width as well. So after that I added Pro Q2. It's in mid-side mode. I've cut out a lot of the lows and fixed a bit of the stereo information. The last layer of the snare is a transient. So I loaded it into Groove Agent, which is a drum sampler, which I'll go through in a moment. I just used it for the initial hit. So now let's hear the snares with the drum breaks. So without. Cool. Let's take a look at the kick drums. So the main kick I used, I made in another project, exported it out, then imported it into this project. I used Cubase's drum machine Groove Agent, loaded the sample in. You can see I've adjusted the envelope of the drum. Let's see what processing's on it. So I've used shaper box. I've actually added some white noise to this. So without. Just adding some top end crunch. After that I've used isotope trash. I've used the wave shaper in the lows, and in the tops I've used amp drainer. After that again I've used shaper box. What this has done has tightened up the kick drum, making it nice and snappy. The final part of the processing is flatline. It's a clipper tool, and I'm using it to shave off some transients. The second kick drum is the same as the first kick drum, just a different pitch. You can see here I've pitched it down 2 semitones. Quite unorthodox for me to have 2 different pitching kick drums, but it worked really well with the breaks, and it just added some variations, very subtle. I added a live kick layer. That was made in addictive drums. I've rendered it to audio, and let's have a look at the processing. I've cut out some of the lows with the Cubase stock EQ, and again I've used Fab Filter, Pro Q. It's in mid-side mode. I cut out a lot of the low stereo information, some of the top stereo information, and this I've used to cut a rogue frequency. Now let's have a listen to the kicks with the breaks. So without. Let's put the snares in as well. Wicked. Right, there's some other elements to the drums. Let's scroll down. You have a crash here. It's a standard crash, which has been in many of my tracks. Just sounds really good, really nice and clean. And I programmed some additional hi-hats using Serum. Let's have a look at it. So essentially, I'm using LFO2 to control a few different parameters, but it's mainly about this white noise here. This is the shape and the groove of the hi-hats. Let's have a listen. You know, you can see I've done some cuts with the filter. The hyper's not in use. I've done another cut with this EQ here. And a little boost. A small amount of compression. The reverb's not in use, the mix is on 0. And I've used a phaser here to add some stereo. Let's look at the processing. Again, I've used isotope trash. The mix is on 0, so the lows aren't being affected. Same with the mids. On the tops, I've used a wave shaper here, and I've also used the filter section here. So let's check out the drums as a whole. What I can see here is some other variations of snare drums, different pitches that change with the different breaks. Essentially they're the same sounds, just pitched differently. That's a quick look at the drums. So let's move on. So I made these basses in audio. I actually went to my friend TB's house, ran a lot of my bass patches for a lot of his hardware. We was using various outboard gear, some really nice stuff. A lot of the tonality of these sounds came from running them through the Culture Vulture. I actually took a lot of my Serum sample packs, called up lots of patches, adjusted many parameters, and was feeding them through TB's gear, getting some really crazy results. As I was doing it, I was recording all the audio, and I ended up with various different respaces, lots of different crazy sounds, which I could then chop up later. I actually started this track at home. As I already said, I'd pre-produced the drum breaks in my studio. Now I had some basses which I'd pre-produced at TB's studio. I sat at home, started making the track. I originally started it in Ableton. Once I got some cool loops going, I was kind of happy with it. I exported them and then brought them into Cubase for when I was in the studio. So let's have a look at the basses. So yeah, it's a question and answer riff. So you've got the first bass here, your answer bass, your next section. You know, there's a lot going on. First of all, let's have a look at this main bass here, Reese main drop. As you can see, the bass is pretty full. It's not completely maxed out, but I'm sure there's some clipping on the waveform somewhere. Let's look at the processing. Pro Q2, fixing some of the stereo, amplifying some of the stereo, cutting some of the stereo. I do all this by ear. Crave 2, taking some of the tops out, boosting some of the lows. Then I use the chorus to add some more stereo. These are the settings. Nothing crazy. So without it. With it. It's pretty subtle stuff. Let's look at the Reese answer. There's a small amount of EQ on this, cutting a little bit of the lower mids. And you've got this last little block here, which is the womp sound, which is pre-processed and rendered to audio. The next section has these stabs. And down here we have this one called Pig Bass, which I think is from one of my sample packs. I just looped it up, chopped it up a bit so it creates this groove. Use Crave EQ, cut some of the rogue frequencies, some of the lows and tops. Let's look at these here. You've got turn bass. See, it has a fade on it. You've got Reese drop here, using the same processing that was already on that channel. This is one of my favourite basses, end bass. I could probably make an entire tune out of that. I just love the tonality of it. So again, let's look at the processing. Fix some of the stereo information. Again, Crave 2. Looks like a copy of the channel above. If we skip further through the track, there's this bass here. Same processing. To make this, I took one of the bounces of audio, put it in a sampler, played the riff, and then rendered it to audio. So let's check out the basses in full. There's one other section to this record I want to go over quickly. Build up basses. As you can see here, it's again rendered to audio. Small amount of processing. Crave EQ. Pro Q2 fixing some of the stereo information. So I'm cutting the stereo here, boosting some of the mids here. As you can see, I've cut the stereo here and here. I've used a high cut with a stock Cubase EQ. Again, this is done by ear. So now we've looked at the bass, I want to look at this here, the chords. So I played some chords, resampled them, put them in Contact, and I played a riff that was wonky, it was out of key essentially, but it was just what I wanted for this section, something that was a bit weird and kind of like made you think, what the hell's that? Let's have a listen. So it's like an old school throwback. It's more about the groove than anything else. So in the track, it works with the drum edit. And the basses sound sick too. Let's see what processing I've added to it. More trash, multi-band mode. The lows aren't being affected, nor are the mids. Just some top end crunch with amp drainer. You can see the mix here and here. So now we're going to take a look at the intro music. In this chords folder, there's one additional sound. So I'm going to solo that and solo this folder here. So we're looking at this section here. All these sounds are made in various different synths, VSTs, from Moog synths to UVI Falcon, and maybe a few others. I just went through, created different chords, different atmospheres, different textures, run them through various bits of processing, rendered them to audio, and then proceeded to make the intro. The reason I do a lot of rendering is my projects are really CPU heavy, and unfortunately my computer can't handle it, especially if I'm sketching ideas on my MacBook. Yeah, I have to render a lot to audio. So let's have a listen. This section here I've looped. I really like this sound. It's a riff I made on a Moog. I added some reverb, I overcompressed it, probably added some trash. The compressor's pulling out the reverb, making the sound really crunchy. So now let's look at the effects. Again, I've made all these sounds. They're made in various different synths. I added various things like reverb and compression, probably a bit of saturation, rendered them down. Let's take a listen to them. So essentially that's a kick with a big reverb. An impact sound. Again, some more kicks. I'm going to play it from here. This sound here I made with a noise generator. And again, this sound. I use Reactor for that. And there's a few more sound effects following on. And this sound here, I've reversed. There's a kind of riser. But yeah, there's plenty of different effects throughout this, creating a bed for the intro. This sound here was a bass sound I'd made. It wasn't strong enough to actually fit in the record, but I like the tonality of it, and it fits well on the intro. Now let's have a look at the intro vocals. I actually got these vocals from Splice. When I was making the track, I thought, right, I really want a vocal. I really want a big female, old school vocal. So I went through loads of samples on Splice and then come across some of these. I managed to chop them up and make them fit the record, and it was just what I was looking for. Let's quickly check them out. So this here, I chopped a vocal and looped it up, and I've used some automation here. So I've created my own delay essentially. Some more variation on the vocals. And you've got this one just before the drop. You can hear it's got different ping pong delays on it. Those were rendered into the sound. Let's look at the processing. Again, isotope trash, nothing on the lows, nothing on the mids, and I used amp drainer on the top end, adding some more saturation. So now we've taken a look at the track. We're going to go through some of the mixing techniques now, some of the bussing, some of the effect sends, and some of the additional processing. So this is the mixer section of Cubase. What you can see here in blue, these are group channels, and these are effect sends. So if you use Logic, these are called buses. So what essentially a group is, you can take a number of sounds and send them to one fader. With these groups, you can also add more effects, process, and so on. When I was mixing this track, I wasn't too worried about levels. I wasn't worried about clipping channels. I was gain staging my plugins, but I wasn't worried about the internal channels of Cubase. The only fader I do worry about clipping really is the master fader, for obvious reasons. So let's solo this group here, kicks. Yeah, as you can see, I'm redlining quite a lot, but I'm not too worried about it. Once we get to the mastering stage, I'll explain how I took care of that. So let's check what effects I've used. Pro Q3, nothing's happening. I use Pro L2 to catch some of the transients. Again, flatline, catching more of the transients, clipping them off. And Crave 2, and boosted some of the lows, cutting some of the mids, boosting some of the highs. And there's a cut here. From there, I sent this group to this group, which is called Drum Bits, fix some of the stereo information, and then this is routed to Drums All, again fixing more of the stereo information. So it's an unorthodox way of grouping. I would never normally do it like this. This was just to get the track over the line. This track had to sound dirty, kind of old school. It doesn't have to be super clinical like a kilohertz record. So some of my routing's all over the place, to be honest. Looking at it now, I'm thinking, wow, why have I done that? But it's mainly me being lazy. So this group here, pitch snares comes in later in the track. There's some grouping on the breaks, using Synths 2 just to tame some of the tops, tame some of the rogue frequencies. So let's move on from the drums. We have sub here. I didn't actually end up using this group, so ignore this. But we've got the synth group here. This is where a lot of the heavy lifting happens. Let's solo it and have a look at the processing. So first of all, use FabFilter's Pro MB. I'm essentially just boosting the lows more like an EQ, and there's a bit of compression here. After that, I took the Ozone Vintage compressor, put it in mid-side mode. The mids I'm not compressing, the sides I compress quite heavily, and then gave them some gain boost. So it's essentially controlling the side information of this, but then boosting it some more. After that, I've used Synths 2, trying to tame some of the rogue frequencies. This is by Acoustica Audio. It's modelled on high-end analog gear. Acoustica plugins are absolutely amazing. You should go and check them out. What I've done here is boosted massively, around 10k, about 9 decibels. So this EQ is a tube EQ. It's way more forgiving than, say, if you'd done this with, say, Pro Q. You would push out a lot of the sort of more harsh frequencies, where this adds some saturation at the same time. Then we have Pro Q again. You know, you can see I'm very meticulous with my stereo information, especially on this track. Removing some of the lows. There's a small cut there as well. Now let's have a look at the sidechain. This is assigned to the kick drum. With these types of settings, I used the hold function, worked out the millisecond length of my kick, And yeah, let's see it in action. As you can see, the compressor's really ducking every time the kick hits. Same with the snare drum. As you can see here, I've used this filter section, just cleaning up the source, making the sidechain more accurate. Removing any information I don't need. This filter doesn't affect the synth sounds. It really just cleans up the source coming into the compressor so it can react better. Let's take a quick look at the chord section and let's check the processing. I'm using trash again in multiband mode. After that, Pro L2. Squeezing the sound a bit more, just making it a bit fatter. Again, I've added more sidechain, just ducking when the kick and snare hit. Onto the music. I've used trash again for more saturation, some more limiting, just to keep a lid on things. Again, more sidechaining, and a final bit of trash, adding more and more saturation. The sound effects group, I've cleaned up some of the lows and some of the highs. A little bit more limiting, as you can see here, more sidechain from the kick and snare. Onto the vocals here. I use this plugin here, Decapitator, to add some crunch to the vocals. Without it. The key to getting a fat track is lots of little bits of saturation throughout. Back when I first started, I'd just whack a distortion unit on my snare drum and put it on full and think that would do the trick. But over time, you realise that doesn't work. So now we're going to look at these effects faders here. We're going to go back to the drums, solo the drums. So let's start here. I've used a transient shaper. So I can put some of the transients back in. If I've squashed them too much with limiters or it's lacking in transients, I have control of an independent transient that I can turn up or down. It's very subtle, but it does have an effect. I have another one here for the snare drum. So this channel here is saturation. I use FabFilter Saturn. Just creating a bit more crunch. Again, I can fade that into taste. Here I've added a reverb to the kick drum. Using the stock Cubase reverb, I've probably shortened it down and just adjusted some of the parameters. It gives the kick drum a bit more of a natural sound and it adds a bit of stereo width. This fader here, I've used some parallel compression on the snare drum using the CLA2A, which is based on the LA2A compressor. Again, I can fade this into taste. The next fader we're going to look at is this here. I've used Shaper Box, used the filter section and the drive section, just to add some more crunch, another layer to the snare, fatten it up. I've used the gain tool to turn it down a bit. And again, Sooth 2, taming a lot of the tops. Let's check out this effects end. Again, Shaper Box, on the kick drum, using the drive and the filter section. Just to add more saturation, more character, a little bit more punch to the kick. So now we looked at the drums, let's take a look at the synths. The main effects end I really want to show you is this section here. What I found with these basses were they were lacking in a lot of low frequency. So I tried my best to push it out on the group channel here, but it was still lacking. So if I take this off and we solo it. So I could hear there wasn't any super lows, and on this frequency analyzer I could even see it. So what I did, I took the synths and I sent them to this effects channel. So I used Pro MB, soloed this band and compressed it slightly. So again, I took out any rogue stereo information that might be there and added some sidechain. I then blended this fader in with the original synth group and it sounds like this. You can see it really enhancing the low end. The last effects ends I want to talk about are these reverbs. We've got them here and here. So I've set up a reverb here. It's around about a bar. You can see the pre-delay there. You can see the times. The other one's got different settings. You can see the decay's longer and also a different pre-delay amount. As you can see, I've set the levels differently. I wanted more of the 1 bar. and less of the 2-bar. Once I was happy with these, I sent them to a group. I soloed the group, and let's check out the processing. I used Crave EQ to cut some of the lows and highs, boost a tiny bit of the mids, Saturn 2 using the warm tape and adding some drive, a little bit of boost in the top end, Pro L2 just to put a lid on things, and then again there's some more side chaining. So let's check out the reverb. So without the plugins, with the plugins, again it's very subtle. So that's a quick look at the mixing stage of this record. You know, every record is different, every process is different. There's no right or wrong way to mix a record. I don't normally redline so much, but this record just needed to be crunchy, and I just wanted to get it finished and get it out there. I didn't want to sit mixing this down forever, making it too clinical. I was like, yeah, that'll do, that's it, that's raggo enough, let's just release it. Going through this project, I can see different places where I could have changed things, mixed things differently, maybe improved things, but I don't want to be sitting on music for too long. I was happy with it. The overall tone of the record was kind of what I was looking for, rough around the edges, raggo, so I just went with it. The final part of this tutorial is the mastering stage. I'm going to open up the master fader. Let's take a look. As you saw, a lot of my groups are running a bit hot, so I needed to put some of the headroom back, especially if you're using analog modeling plugins. You don't want to clip them, or even hardware, so I've dropped it by 18 decibels. Next in the chain is this EQ. It's by Acoustica and John Oram, and it's called Opal. I actually own the hardware unit of this EQ, but this plugin is equally as good. I added this EQ to the master bus early on in the mix stage. I mixed into it. I love the tone of it. I love the top end. It's an amazing EQ and it adds so much detail. So it was really part of the mix stage as well. Like many plugins, on first look it looks confusing, but don't worry too much. I've only used it to boost the top end. Parameters I've used are the EQ section, the filter section, and the preamp section here. I've used the high shelf from 6K and boosted some of the tops. Filters, I've cut some of the super lows and some of the super highs. Let's check out what it sounds like with and without this EQ. So with, and then without. I'm going to skip this plugin for the moment because we're going to go back to it because I added this towards the end. I then used Ozone 9 Match EQ. I used Pink Noise as reference, captured the audio through it, and adjusted some of the parameters to taste. After that, I've used Pro L2, put it in transparent mode. These are my settings, and I've increased the gain to start limiting. So it's limiting quite heavily. We can do it before and after. So it's adding the loudness, adding a bit more crunch, making things sound fatter. The final part of the mastering chain was a clipper. I wouldn't normally add a clipper after a limiter, but it added even more crunch and made the track sound even more dirty. It also increased the loudness even more. And the final plugin I used was Newfangled Punctuate. This is like a multi-band transient shaper. I felt where I'd squashed the track too much with a limiter and flatline the clipper, I needed to put some of the transients back in. So I went back and added this plugin. And it put some of the transient smack back in the record. So we can do it before and after. Throughout the mix stage, the mastering stage, I'll be using a frequency analyzer. This one's by NewGen. Just keeping an eye on all the frequencies, making sure I've got enough weight in the mids, in the lows, not too much highs, you know, looking for any spikes. I use this analyzer all the time. It's constantly on in my mix. It's my go-to to just make sure everything's hitting in the right place. Yeah, so that's a walkthrough of my single loudmouth. We've gone over many things from sound design to mixing and mastering. Yeah, there's loads to take in. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments section. Please like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all again very soon. All right, easy.